Margaret Johnson, a 68-year-old janitor at Hartwell Industries, pushed her cleaning cart down the long corridor. Her movements were slow but purposeful, shaped by over 4 decades of dedicated service. Yet to most employees, she was invisible, a silent presence who materialized only when there was a mess to clean. But today, Margaret's life was about to take an unexpected turn, and a single confrontation would shatter her daily routine, exposing the darker side of corporate culture. What unfolded next would turn Margaret's quiet humiliation into the catalyst for something far greater. Before diving in, let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe. Margaret's thoughts drifted to her grandchildren as she moved toward the executive wing. Losing her daughter 2 years ago had forced her to take on responsibilities she never expected at this stage of life. Every ache in her back and creak in her knees reminded her why retirement wasn't an option. She had mouths to feed and bills to pay. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," came a gentle voice, pulling her from her reverie. James Anderson, a young accountant, was smiling at her. Unlike most, James made an effort to acknowledge her presence. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," Margaret replied warmly, her weariness momentarily forgotten. "How are the grandkids doing?" James asked sincerely. A rare smile crossed Margaret's face. "They're growing like weeds, keeping me on my toes, that's for sure." Before the moment could linger, a sharp voice sliced through the air. "Don't you have work to do instead of chatting with the help?" Richard Blackwell, the department manager, approached with a sneer, his polished shoes echoing in the hallway. His icy gaze swept over Margaret dismissively before landing on James. James straightened, his easy demeanor replaced by professional caution. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. I'll get back to my desk." As James hurried away, Richard turned his full attention to Margaret. "And you," he barked. "Make sure you actually clean properly today. I'm tired of seeing dust in the corners." Margaret lowered her gaze. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. I'll do my best." Richard scoffed and strode off, leaving her alone in the hallway. Margaret took a steadying breath, swallowing the sting of his words. It wasn't the first time Richard had humiliated her, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. When Margaret first started at Hartwell Industries, the company had felt like family. Managers appreciated her hard work, and colleagues treated her with respect. But things changed. New management brought new faces, and Hartwell became colder. Richard Blackwell epitomized that shift. Ruthless, arrogant, and cruel. To him, Margaret was an unwanted relic of a bygone era. What Richard failed to see was that his actions were not going unnoticed. James Anderson had been observing Richard's treatment of Margaret for months. Each interaction chipped away at his conscience. He was young, eager to succeed, and well aware of Richard's influence, but witnessing Margaret's quiet endurance left him conflicted. Was staying silent worth it? Later that day, Margaret was on her knees in the executive restroom, scrubbing a stubborn stain when the door swung open. She froze at the sound of Richard's footsteps on the tile floor. Well, Richard's voice dripped with disdain. "Still pretending to work, Johnson?" Margaret slowly rose, clutching the mop for support. "I'm doing my best, sir." Richard stepped closer, his cologne mixing with the sharp scent of bleach. "Your best?" he mocked. "This place looks like a gas station bathroom. You're past your expiration date, Johnson. You're obsolete. You should have been replaced years ago." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she said nothing. Years of enduring such words had taught her silence was often the safest response. Unbeknownst to them, James was in a nearby stall, frozen in disbelief. He watched through the gap in the door as Margaret stood there, her shoulders trembling under the weight of Richard's abuse. "People like you don't belong here," Richard sneered. "You're holding this company back." With that final blow, Richard turned on his heel and left, leaving Margaret alone. As soon as the door closed, her composure broke. She slid down against the wall and sobbed quietly. James, still hidden, felt his heart shatter. When Margaret finally left, James emerged, his hands shaking as he stared into the mirror. The guilt was unbearable. "I should have said something," he whispered. But fear held him back. Fear of losing his job, his career, and everything he'd worked for. In the days that followed, James couldn't shake the image of Margaret's tears. He began showing her small acts of kindness, leaving a cup of coffee on her cart, ensuring his workspace was tidy, encouraging others to do the same. "Why don't we keep our desks clean?" he suggested to his colleagues. "It makes Mrs. Johnson's job easier." Some agreed, others rolled their eyes. But James persisted. Margaret noticed. Though Richard's cruelty didn't stop, these small gestures gave her a glimmer of hope. One evening, James approached her as she finished her shift. "Mrs. Johnson," he said softly, "thank you for everything you do. I want you to know your work matters." Margaret's eyes welled up. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. That means more than you know." But James knew words weren't enough. Richard's reign of terror continued, and whispers began to ripple through the office. Employees started sharing stories of mistreatment, their frustration mounting. The tension was palpable, and James realized change was inevitable. Richard Blackwell's behavior had been unchecked for too long, but now the cracks were showing. Margaret's quiet resilience, James's growing courage, and the collective anger of the employees were building towards something greater. Hartwell Industries was about to face a reckoning, and the most unlikely of heroes, a humble janitor, would become the symbol of a long-overdue corporate revolution. The constant stress of Richard's harassment, along with her exhaustion and worry for her grandchildren, began to take a toll on Margaret. One difficult morning, as she pushed her cart down the hallway, the bright fluorescent lights felt blinding, and the noise of the office seemed deafening. Feeling lightheaded, she paused to lean against the wall and catch her breath. James, passing by with a stack of reports, noticed her distress. "Mrs. Johnson, are you okay?" he asked, concern clear in his voice. Margaret tried to smile, but the room tilted and she collapsed before James's horrified eyes. "Mrs. Johnson!" James shouted, dropping his papers and rushing to her side. "Someone call an ambulance!" The office erupted into chaos as employees gathered, some trying to help, others just staring. Richard Blackwell stormed out of his office, irritation written all over his face. "What's all this commotion?" he demanded, pushing through the crowd. When he saw Margaret on the floor, he scoffed. "For heaven's sake, can't she even stay on her feet? This is why we need younger, more capable staff." James, still kneeling beside Margaret, glared at him. "Mr. Blackwell, she needs help. This is serious." Richard waved him off. "Fine, call an ambulance. But she's not coming back until she's fit for work. We're not running a nursing home here." Paramedics arrived and carefully lifted Margaret onto a stretcher. James watched the ambulance drive away, anger boiling inside him. Richard's heartlessness, his utter lack of empathy, was unbearable. But James stayed silent, afraid to risk his job. The incident shook the office. Colleagues whispered about what had happened. "Is it true Blackwell didn't even care?" someone asked James at lunch. James nodded grimly. He was more worried about work than her health. "That's Richard for you," another said in disgust. "Someone needs to do something about him." "What can we do?" James asked. He has the board in his pocket. Speaking up means losing your job. The group fell silent, weighed down by helplessness. Days passed without news of Margaret's condition. Slowly, the office returned to its routine. But for James, nothing felt normal anymore. Every time he saw Margaret's unused cleaning cart, guilt gnawed at him. He replayed the collapse in his mind, haunted by the thought of what he could have done differently. One evening, working late, James overheard a hushed conversation. "Did you hear?" Sarah from HR whispered. "We're getting a new CEO." "Really? What happened to Jennings?" asked Tom from marketing. "Retiring. The new guy's name is Harrison." James froze. A new CEO could mean change, a chance to fix the toxic culture Richard had created. But doubt crept in. What if the new boss was just as bad? The next day, the office buzzed with rumors about the mysterious Mr. Harrison. Some claimed he was a cost cutter, others a reformer. Richard, meanwhile, was fuming, barking orders and snapping at everyone. "I don't care who this new CEO is," Richard grumbled on a call. No outsider is going to change what I've built. James's spine tingled. It was clear Richard had no plans to change. That afternoon, returning from a coffee run, James nearly bumped into a casually dressed man, slacks and a polo shirt, not the usual office attire. "Oh, sorry," James said, stepping aside. The man smiled warmly. "No problem at all." James blinked, curiosity stirring. Could this be the new CEO? For the first time in a long while, hope flickered in his chest. "Excuse me, you wouldn't happen to know where I might find Richard Blackwell's office, would you?" James looked up and gestured down the hallway. "Last door on the right. You can't miss it. It's the biggest office on the floor." "Appreciate it," the man replied, but then paused as if reconsidering something. "I'm new around here. Anything I should know about Mr. Blackwell before I head in?" James froze, his mind racing. Should he warn this stranger about Richard's notorious behavior? What if the man was one of Richard's friends, or worse, someone testing the loyalty of the staff? Choosing his words carefully, James said, "Mr. Blackwell is very results-driven. He likes things done a certain way." The man nodded thoughtfully, taking in the comment. "Good to know. Thanks." "James," he added after a beat. "James Anderson." "Pleasure to meet you, James," the man said with a smile, extending a hand. They shook firmly before the stranger added, "I have a feeling we'll be seeing more of each other." As the man disappeared down the hallway, James felt uneasy, as though he'd just missed his chance to say something important. He slumped back into his chair, silently berating himself for his lack of courage. Minutes later, a loud commotion shattered the office's usual hum. Richard's voice erupted from behind his door, furious and unfiltered. "Who do you think you are? Marching in here dressed like that, asking questions? This is my department and I won't have some low-level hire telling me how to run things." The entire floor fell into an uneasy silence, heads turning toward Richard's office. James's heart thudded painfully as he stared at the closed door. Everyone knew Richard could be sharp, but this was an entirely new level of unprofessional. Then, the door burst open. The man James had met earlier stepped out. His expression was calm, almost unfazed, but his eyes were icy with intent. Richard followed close behind, face crimson and breathing heavily. Before anyone could speak, the stranger's voice rang out across the office, loud and clear. "I believe," he said, his words measured but cutting, "that it's time we had a company-wide meeting. Immediately." James's breath caught as realization washed over him. He knew who this man must be. The stranger confirmed it as he turned back to the stunned room. "I'm Michael Harrison, your new CEO, and it seems there are some deeply rooted issues we need to address." The office buzzed with shock. Employees exchanged wide-eyed looks, some daring to smirk at Richard's growing discomfort. Richard himself looked pale, as though he'd been slapped. "I want everyone in the main conference room in 5 minutes," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice brooking no argument. "It's time for an honest discussion about this company's culture." The tension in the air seemed to break as people began moving, whispers spreading like wildfire. James remained in his seat for a moment, emotions swirling. Relief that someone had finally called Richard out, dread over what this meant for the company, and regret that he'd never spoken up himself. In the conference room, employees filed in quietly. The air was thick with anticipation. Richard slinked in last, taking a seat as far from Mr. Harrison as possible. At the front, Mr. Harrison stood with an air of quiet authority, his casual attire starkly contrasting the rows of rigid suits. Once the room settled, he began. "My intention today was to observe, to understand how this company operates," he said firmly, but not unkindly. "What I've seen in just a few short hours, however, tells me we have some serious work ahead." He paused, his sharp gaze scanning the room. "I believe that every employee, no matter their role or background, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. What I witnessed today is a direct violation of that standard." Richard shifted uneasily in his chair but kept his mouth shut. Mr. Harrison's voice hardened. "Let me make this perfectly clear. Harassment, discrimination, or abuse of any kind will not be tolerated under my leadership." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Some employees looked visibly relieved, others anxious. James, meanwhile, was frozen, unable to believe what he was hearing. "I understand that change can be uncomfortable," Mr. Harrison continued, his tone softening just a little. "But it is necessary. Starting tomorrow, we'll implement new policies to create a safer, more respectful workplace for everyone." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And to anyone who has witnessed or experienced inappropriate behavior, my door is always open. Your concerns will be heard, and they will be addressed." As people began to leave, James felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he saw Mr. Harrison beside him. "James, right? Could we have a word in private?" James swallowed nervously, but nodded. He followed Mr. Harrison to a small meeting room. Once inside, the CEO's demeanor softened. "James, I couldn't help but notice your reaction earlier," Mr. Harrison said, his voice calm and encouraging. "Is there something you'd like to share with me?" James hesitated, years of fear holding him back. But then he thought of Margaret, of everything he'd witnessed, and made his choice. "Yes," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "There is, and it's time someone said something." For the next hour, James recounted everything: Richard's treatment of certain employees, Margaret's breakdown, and the toxic atmosphere that had plagued the department. With each word, it felt as though a weight was lifting from his chest. Mr. Harrison listened intently, his expression serious. When James finished, the CEO leaned back thoughtfully. "Thank you, James. That took courage. I want you to know you've done the right thing." James nodded, a mix of relief and nervousness bubbling inside him. "What happens now?" "Now," Mr. Harrison said firmly, "we start making things right. For Margaret, for you, for everyone." As James left the room, he looked around the office with fresh eyes. The fear he'd carried for so long hadn't disappeared, but it felt smaller now, overshadowed by something new. Hope. "Say, you wouldn't happen to know where Richard Blackwell's office is, would you?" James looked up and gestured down the hallway. "Last door on the right," he said. "It's the largest office on this floor. You can't miss it." "Appreciate it," the man replied, pausing briefly. "I'm new around here. Anything I should know about Mr. Blackwell before I meet him?" James froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Should he caution this newcomer about Richard's behavior? But what if this man was close to Richard, or worse, here to test the staff's loyalty? Choosing his words carefully, James replied, "Mr. Blackwell is extremely results-driven. He runs a very tight operation." The man gave a knowing nod. "Got it. Thanks for the help," he added, extending a hand. "James, right?" "James Anderson," James supplied, shaking his hand. "Good to meet you, James. I'm sure we'll run into each other again soon." With that, the man turned and headed down the hall. James sat back at his desk, feeling uneasy. He couldn't shake the sense that he'd just missed an opportunity to say something important. Instead, he silently chastised himself for holding back, again. The quiet hum of the office was shattered minutes later by a commotion coming from Richard's office. Richard's furious voice carried through the door, loud and unmistakable. "Who do you think you are?" Richard bellowed. "Waltzing in here? Dressed like that? Asking questions? This is my department, and I won't be told how to run it by some low-level diversity hire." The room fell into stunned silence. Everyone froze, their eyes fixed on the closed door. James's heart pounded in his chest. Richard had always been abrasive, but this was another level entirely. Suddenly, the door swung open. The man James had just spoken to emerged, his expression calm, but his gaze cold and unwavering. Behind him, Richard followed, face red with fury. The stranger turned and addressed the entire office, his voice clear and firm. "I think it's time we called a company-wide meeting. Immediately." James's stomach dropped. That tone, that authority. It was then he realized who this man must be. His suspicion was confirmed moments later when the man continued. "I'm Michael Harrison, your new CEO, and it seems we've got some serious problems to deal with." The room rippled with shock. Employees exchanged wide-eyed looks, some barely hiding smiles at Richard's obvious discomfort. Richard himself looked as though the ground had been ripped out from under him, his face pale and his mouth opening and closing in stunned silence. Mr. Harrison turned back to the room. "Everyone. Conference room. 5 minutes. We need to have an honest discussion about the culture here." As people began filing out, murmuring among themselves, James felt a storm of emotions. Relief that Richard's toxic behavior was being addressed, nervousness about what might happen next, and guilt that he hadn't spoken up sooner. The conference room buzzed with quiet tension as employees settled in. Richard lingered near the back, keeping his distance from the front of the room where Mr. Harrison now stood. Dressed casually, Mr. Harrison cut a stark contrast to the sea of formal suits in the room. He waited for everyone to quiet down before he spoke. "I came here today, intending to observe and learn about the way this company operates," he began, his tone even but firm. "In just a few hours, I've seen enough to know we have some very serious problems that need fixing." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Every single employee here, no matter their position or background, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. What I witnessed today, that doesn't align with the company I intend to lead." Richard shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "Let me be absolutely clear," Mr. Harrison continued. "Discrimination, harassment, and bullying have no place here. Under my leadership, that behavior stops, immediately." A quiet ripple of murmurs ran through the room. Some employees looked relieved, while others exchanged nervous glances. James sat on edge, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "I know that change is hard," Mr. Harrison said, his voice softening slightly. "But it's necessary. Starting tomorrow, new policies will be implemented to create a workplace that's fair, safe, and welcoming for everyone." He looked over the crowd. "For anyone who has experienced or witnessed inappropriate behavior, my door is open. I promise you'll be heard, and your concerns will be addressed." As the meeting wrapped up and people began to file out, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Mr. Harrison standing there. "James, isn't it?" Mr. Harrison said. "Yes, sir," James replied nervously. "Would you mind joining me for a private word?" Mr. Harrison asked. James nodded, his palms suddenly damp, and followed him into a nearby meeting room. Once the door closed, Mr. Harrison's demeanor shifted to something more approachable. "James, I couldn't help but notice how you reacted earlier," he said gently. "Is there something you'd like to share with me?" James hesitated, torn between fear and a desire to finally do the right thing. He thought of all the times he'd stayed silent, of Margaret and the others who'd been mistreated. Taking a shaky breath, he spoke. "Yes, Mr. Harrison. There's a lot you need to know." Over the next hour, James laid everything out. Richard's abusive treatment of employees, the incidents no one talked about, the way people like Margaret had been treated. As he spoke, he felt as though a massive weight was being lifted from his chest. When he finished, Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his face serious. "Thank you, James. That took courage. You've given me what I need to start making things right." "What happens now?" James asked quietly. "Now," Mr. Harrison said firmly, "we fix this. For you, for Margaret, and for everyone else who's been hurt by this toxic culture. It won't happen overnight, but things will change." As James left the room, he looked out over the office with fresh eyes. The fear he'd carried for so long was still there, but now it was overshadowed by something else. Hope. For the first time in years, it felt like things might actually get better. "Johnson, I'm here today to offer you a sincere apology on behalf of the company," Mr. Harrison began softly. "The way you've been treated is unacceptable, and I want you to know that changes are already underway." He continued, laying out a series of reforms being implemented at the company. Changes that included a thorough review of working conditions and fair compensation for all employees. But it was what he said next that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "We'd like to offer you an early retirement package," Mr. Harrison said kindly. "It includes full benefits and a pension that will ensure you and your grandchildren are well cared for. It's the least we can do to make up for what you've been through." Margaret's hand shook as she reached out to take his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know how much this means to me." As they left the hospital, James felt a weight lift, a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. "Thank you for doing that," he said to Mr. Harrison. "It means so much, not just to Margaret, but to all of us who've worked with her over the years." Mr. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "It's a start," he said. "There's still a long road ahead if we're going to truly change this company's culture, but it's a step in the right direction." Then, he turned to James with a small smile. "Speaking of which, I have a proposition for you. How would you feel about heading up our new employee relations department? We need someone who understands the challenges we've faced and isn't afraid to stand up when something isn't right." James blinked, stunned. "Me? But I didn't speak up for so long. I let things happen when I should have said something. And yet, when the moment came, you did speak up," Mr. Harrison replied firmly. "That takes courage, James. The kind of courage we need to create real, lasting change." As James stood there, considering the offer, he realized this was his chance. His chance to make things right and ensure what happened to Margaret would never happen to anyone else. "I'd be honored," he said at last, his voice steady with new determination. "Excellent," Mr. Harrison said, clapping James on the shoulder. "We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I have no doubt we're going to turn Hartwell Industries into a place where everyone can thrive." As they walked to the car, James felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The challenges ahead were clear, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them head-on. In the months that followed, Hartwell Industries underwent a remarkable transformation. Under Mr. Harrison's leadership, and with James's tireless dedication to improving employee relations, the toxic culture that had festered under Richard Blackwell's management began to dissolve. After a thorough investigation, Richard was removed from his position. The evidence against him, from James's testimony to accounts shared by numerous employees, was damning. His termination sent a powerful message. Discriminatory behavior and abuse would no longer be tolerated. James embraced his new role with unwavering commitment. As head of the Employee Relations Department, he implemented new policies, organized training sessions, and, most importantly, created a safe space where employees felt heard and supported. One of James's first major initiatives was a mentorship program. He paired new employees with seasoned staff members to foster a sense of community, provide guidance, and help younger professionals navigate their careers. The positive changes were undeniable. Hartwell Industries began to flourish, not just in performance but in morale. Employees who had once felt overlooked or undervalued now felt seen, respected, and empowered. For James, the transformation was deeply personal. What had begun as a moment of hesitation in the hallway had led him to become the voice of change within the company. And as he watched the positive ripple effects of his work, he knew that this was only the beginning of a brighter future. To James's pleasant surprise, Margaret agreed to step in as an advisor for the program, offering her wealth of knowledge and experience even in her retirement. The transformation at Hartwell Industries didn't go unnoticed across the business world. As news spread about the company's renewed commitment to fairness and equality, Hartwell quickly became a magnet for top-tier talent from diverse backgrounds. The influx of fresh ideas and perspectives sparked an era of innovation, boosting productivity. As a result, the company's performance began to reflect these positive changes. Yet for James, the most rewarding part of the transformation was the shift he saw in his colleagues. The air of fear and resignation that once lingered throughout the office had been replaced with optimism and engagement. People smiled more, collaborated more freely, and genuinely looked forward to coming to work every day. One afternoon, James received an unexpected visitor in his office. It was Margaret, looking more vibrant and content than he had seen her in years. "Mrs. Johnson," James said, standing up with a warm smile. "It's so good to see you. How have you been?" Margaret's eyes sparkled as she sat down. "I'm doing wonderfully, James. Or should I say, Mr. Anderson, head of employee relations." James chuckled, still adjusting to his new title. "Just James, please, Mrs. Johnson. You've known me long enough to skip the formalities." "Well then, it's Margaret for you," she replied with a grin. She glanced around his office, nodding approvingly. You've done well for yourself, James, but more importantly, you've done well for others. I've heard about all the positive changes you've made here. James felt a swell of pride. We've made progress, but we still have a long way to go. And how's retirement treating you? James asked, eager to hear more. Margaret's face lit up. It's been a true blessing, James. I get to spend time with my grandchildren without the stress of financial worry. And your mentorship program has given me a new sense of purpose. I never imagined I could use my experiences here to help others, but that's exactly what's happening.